An incredible weekend as millions of people in Berlin and London protest against coronavirus lockdowns. No more lockdowns, no more masks, and no forced vaccination. That was the message from these protesters. Plus, we're taking a look at a report from the CDC that's been going around the internet. Claims that only 6% of actual coronavirus deaths are related to only the coronavirus. That statement is true, but is there more to it? I'm Ben Swann, and this is Truth in Media. Hey guys, welcome to the show. What an incredible weekend. Pictures and videos from Berlin and from London as millions of people gathered in protest to the lockdowns that have been occurring, demanding that no longer that their countries be held under draconian laws, instituting the wearing of face masks, the shutdown of schools, and of course the upcoming forced vaccination that many government officials are trying to impose. Yeah, these videos were just absolutely incredible. We're going to show you more of them in a minute, and also an excerpt from a speech given by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which was absolutely just incredible there in Berlin. But before we do, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, ISE.media. We are running an equity crowdfunding campaign right now in order to build a new media and tech site for content creators. This is a place where content creators who are being purged as they are every single day and being kept out of the public view have a place to be able to place their content. ISE.media is running an equity crowdfunding campaign right now. You can be a part of it. Become an equity owner in a media company that is working to break through tech censorship. ISE.media. In Berlin, the site was absolutely incredible as police actually gathered to try to block protesters in many cases, blocking streets and trying to prevent protesters from marching. They could not. Also in Berlin, an incredible speech given by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was launching children's health defense in Europe. And Kennedy spoke about the importance of recognizing this moment as one where those who are in power love pandemics, he says, just the way that they love wars. Listen to this.
Governments love pandemics.
Regierungen lieben Pandemien.
They love pandemics for the same reason they love war.
Und die lieben sie aus den gleichen Gründen, wie sie den Krieg lieben.
Because it gives them the ability to impose controls on the population that the population would otherwise never accept.
And the picture was very much the same in London, again, as we saw massive groups of people protesting. Of course, what you haven't seen are mainstream media organizations in Germany, in the UK, or even here in the United States willing to cover these protests. They have covered racial protests, inequality protests, and protests over Black Lives Matter here in the US. But when it comes to these massive marches in Berlin and the UK, not a word. They don't want to discuss the fact that these marches are happening. And part of the frustration we see from people who are at these marches is the fact that much of the information, including the numbers of deaths related to coronavirus, those numbers are simply not accurate. And that has not been better illustrated than what happened this weekend as the CDC released some staggering new numbers that show just how few deaths in the United States are related to just the coronavirus. Take a look at this. Over the weekend, the Centers for Disease Control dropped this bombshell report on coronavirus/COVID-19 deaths. Of the approximately 165,000 COVID deaths in the United States, less than 10,000, according to the CDC, died from COVID alone. The rest, the vast majority of them, had an average 2.6 serious additional diseases, with the addition, in most cases, of extreme advanced age. So did you get that? According to the CDC, the vast majority of these cases relate to people having 2.6 additional diseases that are severe, and on top of that, are very elderly. So again, only 6% of deaths have COVID-19 as the only cause mentioned, revealing that 94% of patients who died from the coronavirus also had, quote, other health conditions and contributing causes to the level of 2.6 diseases per person on average who died not from COVID, but died with COVID. And that is an important distinction. Now, we should mention that the largest single group out of all these numbers belongs to people who died of unknown conditions and COVID. Unknown conditions associated with COVID. So for the majority of these deaths, what are the other underlying conditions associated with these deaths that, again, are not just from COVID, but with COVID? Influenza and pneumonia, who also died with COVID. Also respiratory failure, hypertensive disease, diabetes, vascular and unspecified dementia, cardiac arrest, heart failure, renal failure, intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning, and other adverse events, as well as other medical conditions. Now, we should break down these numbers for a second here because it's important to separate this out because, as we're called, truth in media, if we want to find truth, you have to really get into the numbers. It is not fair to say that only 6% of the people died from COVID and therefore 94% did not stop. That's not fair. In fact, if you look at these numbers, if we're being honest, then you have to say, well, okay, we know that at least 9,000 people, according to the CDC, died from COVID. And then some of these other thousands of people have died from conditions that may have been exacerbated by COVID, made worse by COVID, or wouldn't have had these conditions had it not been for COVID. Issues like respiratory failure that might have been brought on by COVID-19, and therefore, even though the cause of death is technically respiratory failure, that person wouldn't have died had they not had COVID-19. But if we're going to be fair, you also have to remove many of these other conditions. For instance, intentional and unintentional injury. Or how about poisoning? If you look at the CDC numbers, 5,000 of the deaths listed in the 160-some thousand deaths, 5,000 of them are a result of poisoning. So how in the world are you claiming that is a COVID death if the person died from poisoning? Clearly, COVID-19 did not cause the poisoning to take place. Intentional injury or even unintentional injury would not be related to COVID. Someone isn't intentionally injuring themselves because they got COVID. They're not dying from that. They're dying from their intentional injury. In fact, if you take out Alzheimer's, if you take out sepsis, if you take out dementia, if you take out cancer, you take out the unintentional injury, and then you leave in things like kidney failure, diabetes, obesity, and stroke, if you leave those in, that gives you kind of the most conservative view here. You would have to remove over 50,000 deaths from this CDC number. 50,000 deaths that are not attributed to deaths from COVID, but rather deaths with COVID. So 50,000 absolutely were not caused by COVID, if you break down the numbers, and another 77,000 are unknown. That brings us to over 120,000 of the 160,000 deaths not necessarily attributed to COVID-19. In short, you're talking about a flu season in terms of the numbers of deaths. Are there real deaths associated with COVID-19? Absolutely. Are there people who have died from COVID-19? Absolutely. And are there people who have died from underlying medical conditions that were made worse by COVID-19? Yes. But according to these numbers, it appears that that number of people runs 40,000 people. That's the number, which, by the way, reflects what we find on any given year in terms of a bad flu season. And we don't shut down economies for flu seasons. We don't create forced vaccination programs for flu seasons. And we don't lock down entire populations of people, forcing them to wear masks, keeping kids home from school, and not allowing people to gather in public in the name of the flu season. It doesn't happen. I think what we're beginning to see here, folks, is more and more the numbers beginning to tell the real story, which is that COVID-19, while it is a real virus, is not more deadly in most cases than the seasonal flu. We've been saying this for months, but the numbers now beginning to bear it out. And as we remind you of that, I would also remind you that more and more people, millions upon millions of people, are waking up every single day to that realization. It is why we saw massive crowds forming in Berlin over the weekend, massive crowds in London, and now word that huge groups are going to begin assembling in Australia, a place where the lockdown has been completely out of control. Those marches and protests will begin, I am told, very soon.